Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Monday evening Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm currently in Hamburg, Germany, having a very good time enjoying the winter weather. There's been lots of snow. Today, we're going to be talking about Hegel, perhaps the world's most famous German idealist philosopher. I'm going to try to give you some I don't know, what I would say some advice, some personal advice on reading Hegel. This is going to be an introduction to some of the key ideas within Hegelian philosophy, with a special emphasis on Hegel's idea of the night of the world, or as he puts it actually, die Nacht des Menschen, or die Nacht im Menschen, which is this key distinction between the genitive, the night of man, and the night in man. We can talk about that more in a moment. First of all, if you're new here, this is a weekly introduction to philosophy and theory, but also art and literature and poetry, cinema, live stream lecture that I've been hosting for the past 3 years now. The basic goal is to hopefully share some educational insights into some of my favorite thinkers, but above all, to also inspire you to engage in your own studies, your own reading, and to that end, I'm so grateful that you're joining us from around the world. Please do drop a comment. I see some already, letting me know where you're joining us from. I see some people joining from Michigan. Hello, Michigan. It's wonderful to see you. And also, if you'd like to support these open access lectures, and if you'd like to download all of my lectures as audio files, plus a bonus podcast that I record for members, and of course, most importantly, my ebook series on Zizek and Hegel, please do consider becoming a patron. None of this would be possible without the Patreon, so thank you to the OG patrons. And if you'd like to join our community, there's a link in my bio, or you can go to www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. I see Chile, I see Mexico, I see Persia. Hello, that's wonderful. Texas, hello, Texas. I see Germany, the Netherlands, Bonn, Germany as well. Boston, hello, Boston. Malaysia, Switzerland. It's all quite lovely. Thank you guys so much. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Hegel. And before I begin, I want to briefly say that despite his reputation as one of the world's most dense and obscure and difficult to understand philosophers, I really do hope that you will either read some Hegel or read an introduction to Hegel, or perhaps join my lectures on Hegel, because I think that to me personally, there's no philosopher or thinker more rewarding than Hegel. The more you put into Hegel, the more you get out of him, so to speak. And so hopefully, if this is your first encounter with Hegelian philosophy, this will be like a welcoming gesture into the club, so to speak, of Hegel enthusiasts. And if you're someone who already is a quote-unquote card-carrying Hegelian, then hopefully you will find some new ways of looking at old themes in this live stream. I'm going to try to be here for about 45 minutes or so, so please do make yourself comfortable, as will I, with this appropriately wintry mug of coffee. So I want to begin with a historical anecdote. When Goethe met Hegel. In fact, to set the scene, we find ourselves in Jena, at the University of Jena, which had been, although already this was changing, had been the cultural center, the cultural capital of German Romanticism, and indeed also German science. And if you will, the shining lights of this movement had been Schelling and Fichte when it came to philosophy, and Schiller and Hölderlin when it came to poetry. In fact, Schelling was the one who invited Hegel to come to Jena in the first place. And Goethe really enjoyed visiting Jena. He enjoyed meeting with his friends, especially Schiller. Goethe and Schiller were lifelong friends. And Goethe feared that Jena was becoming a relic of a bygone age, that the enthusiasm and the intellectual vigor that had marked Jena's high point had already started to dissipate. In fact, most of the figures who were associated with Jena, including Schelling and Fichte, had already left. And if you're wondering why Jena proved to be such a enormously rich environment, on the one hand, it had to do with the local laws that allowed for a higher degree of free speech than you might find elsewhere throughout Prussia or the Austrian Empire. But it was also that after the Kantian critique of pure reason, there was an enormous resurgence in interest for philosophy. And the two biggest movements that came out of Kant's critique of pure reason was, on the one hand, Fichte's subjective philosophy, also known as the Ich-Philosophie, the I philosophy, and the Schellingian Natur- or Weltphilosophie. And they couldn't be more different. Schelling is an absolute idealist who believed in the notion of a world system or a world spirit, which I'll return to later, and which of course becomes very influential for Hegel. Whereas Fichte went in the other direction, and Fichte emphasized the subject as being the positor of all reality. Hegel, when he arrives in Vienna, has already imbibed these discussions, is aware of Fichte, is aware of Schelling, but in a sense he's arrived too late. The famous Hegelian quip that the hour of Minerva only takes flight at dusk might as well have been in relationship to Hegel's own experience of arriving at Vienna, the capital of philosophy, the capital of German idealism, once everybody had already left. In fact, Goethe has placed a lot of hope on Hegel, that Hegel can be one of the figures who renews this intellectual spirit in Jena. But he finds himself sorely disappointed. After all, unlike his friends, unlike Fichte, who was a wonderful orator and public speaker, unlike Schelling, who enjoyed a wide-ranging literary and intellectual circle, Hegel mostly kept to himself. In fact, Hegel was largely regarded as an obscurantist, as someone who spoke in riddles, who never made sense. This is a reputation that, of course, he has today, but it's a reputation that began even in Goethe's time. And okay, so let me finally get to the anecdote. So Goethe has placed his hopes on Hegel, that Hegel will bring vitality back to the student body, as it were, at Jena. And so he invites Hegel to give some lectures. In fact, Hegel has to give lectures as part of his responsibilities. And he has only 8 students at the time. And of those 8 students, many write, and some of these written records we still have, that they couldn't understand a single word. In fact, that Hegel proved to be so incredibly dense in his speech and in his lecturing, which consisted to a large part of him simply reading out a lot of his Jena Realphilosophie, that fundamentally, even those who were well-willing and positively inclined, sympathetically inclined towards Hegel, left feeling like they had not understood anything. And at this point, Goethe makes a somewhat interesting and, to my mind, comical suggestion. He writes to a friend saying, "What do we do with the problem of Hegel? How does one solve a problem like Hegel? A brilliant mind who nevertheless clearly isn't able to inspire his students in the way in which, for example, Fichte was able to do." And Goethe comes up with the very simple solution. He basically says, what if we send Hegel to take a class in rhetoric? In other words, what if we make Hegel a better public speaker? And for those of you who know Hegel, you will already understand that this would be beside the point, that if Hegel were a better communicator, then his system wouldn't be his system. I'll return to that in a moment. So Goethe writes this letter to a colleague saying, what if we sent Hegel to like a communications 101 class to make him a better orator? And his interlocutor writes back to him and says, well, actually, I have a better idea. What if we connect Hegel with a German scientist I know who is also impenetrable? And what if these two brilliant men then have to explain to each other their theories as if the other person were not part of their field? So Hegel has to explain his philosophy to the scientist, and the scientist has to explain his mathematical formulas to Hegel. Once again, this suggestion could only be made by someone who is not a Hegelian, who doesn't understand Hegel. Why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Hegel's entire project would have been against this notion that a scientist could speak to a philosopher and that together they could find some interdisciplinary consensus, that they could communicate their ideas. After all, what Hegel was interested in, and this is actually quite important to understand about Hegel, in fact, I would say this is one of the keys to Hegel, is Hegel wanted to systematize philosophy. Hegel was a great systems builder. And this is, if you will, the greatest systematizer in philosophy had until then been Plato. I'll return to that in a moment. However, Hegel's inclination to build systems isn't just something that Hegel scholars have written about Hegel. It's something that Hegel himself said in his letters to Schelling. In fact, Hegel derived inspiration from Schelling's own systematizing interests. Schelling, in his writing, was trying to come up with a system of philosophy, a world system. Now, what is a system, first of all? Well, for Hegel and Schelling, a system wasn't to have either science or empiricism or art or poetry or even history. In fact, they rejected all of those particular positions, those forms of subjective, objective knowledge, as essentially anecdotes. Now, of course, an anecdote isn't empirical. An anecdote is simply something based upon your own life. And yet, from the perspective of Hegel and Schelling, any scientific theory, any, if you will, what today would be called research area that particularized, that was one element out of the whole, was nevertheless, strictly speaking, anecdotal, or what Hegel would later call Verstand. Verstand is what Hegel called understanding. It was essentially something that could be known of the world, but that had the assumption that one could step outside the world so as to study it neutrally. So, for example, if someone said, I'm a historian and I specialize in the 15th century, for Hegel, this would be a form of Verstand. It would be that you have knowledge of something that occurred in the world. Therefore, it by definition can't be part of a system. It's not a grand theory. It's not a meta-narrative, as some people would call it today. And what Schelling and Hegel wanted to do was nothing less, and of course this was insanely ambitious, if you will, was nothing more, nothing less than a theory of everything, a theory of the universe, a theory of God, a theory that would encapsulate all other theories. And the name for this theory was idealism. German idealism, of course, here referring to Schelling and Hegel specifically. And if you take the word idealism, the way in which you might have learned the word idealism in school is very different from what it means here. To be an idealist today is somebody who is somewhat naive, who believes in a better world, someone who sees the glass as being half full, not half empty. An idealist is somebody who believes that cryptocurrencies will make banking more democratic or something like this, right? And for Hegel, this was not what idealism was. It has nothing to do with the idea of a better world, the possibility of a better world. Instead, it was basically the ism, the system of the idea. And if you want to know what that means, because that sounds obscure if you're not into philosophy, there's actually a great quote about this from the philosopher, contemporary philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk. Peter Sloterdijk wrote that theologians saw themselves as being those who spoke the word of God. After Plato, philosophers saw themselves as those who spoke the word of idea. That in the same way that for a priest, the word of God speaks through him, for a philosopher, the word of the universe, of the idea, speaks through him. Which is another way of saying that for Hegel, the idea was the overarching structure, the form, which all content in the world had to take. Therefore, his accusation was that if you're a scientist or if you're a writer, if you're a biologist, if you're a historian, if you're a political theorist, that no matter how smart you were and no matter how accomplished your insights, that nevertheless you were interested in the content of what occurred in the world. In other words, the subjective images that appeared to you. And what Hegel was interested in was the content in the form through which these things occurred in the first place. For those of you who are interested in Marxism, you can already see here a tendency that is continued in Marx's theory of revolution. It's a systematizing, quote-unquote, grand narrative, if you will. It's an evolution of this Hegelian idea. And what Hegel therefore wanted to do was he wanted to create a system to end all systems, a philosophy to end all philosophies. And so the very idea that Hegel could get together with another scientist and exchange tidbits so that the science could help Hegel and Hegel could help the scientist, this form of communication would have been alien to the very idea, no pun intended, of Hegel's central theory. And I want to give you two things here that can hopefully make Hegel a little bit easier to understand. First of all, when Hegel talks about the idea, he usually refers to it as spirit. This goes back to the Schellingian notion of Weltgeist, the spirit of the world. In fact, when Hegel saw Napoleon invading Jena, which is, of course, where Hegel was still working, he referred to Napoleon as the world spirit, or Weltgeist im Sattel, the world spirit sitting in the saddle, world spirit made flesh, as it were. And yet, what's key here is that Hegel wasn't saying that Napoleon was this chosen figure who was going to defeat Prussia and restore a better future. He's not an idealist in that sense. Instead, for Hegel, he saw within the conquest of Napoleon the machinations, the working of a giant machine that he called idea, the unfolding of the idea or spirit through world history and all the content of the world, of which the embodiment was Napoleon riding upon his horse through Jena. In fact, one of the historical ironies of this entire situation of Napoleon invading Jena is that Hegel had it's a really beautiful historical irony, it's very Hegelian, if you will. Hegel had just completed work on his manuscript for what would become his most famous and influential work, namely the Phenomenology of Spirit. For those of you who are not into philosophy or getting into philosophy, phenomenology is about appearance. So essentially it means the appearance of spirit. How does spirit appear? And Hegel had just finished working on the phenomenology of spirit. In fact, he was able to send it out on a postal carrier right before the invasion began, mere hours. And so the irony is that as the document of the theory, the system of world spirit was leaving Jena, at the exact same time, Napoleon, the embodiment of world spirit for Hegel, was about to invade Jena. This irony, this romantic irony, if you will, is a very Hegelian concept in and of itself. In fact, Hegel is one of the great theoretical thinkers of irony, not in like a millennial, everything is ironic because you wear t-shirts with, I don't know, fake bands on them kind of irony, but the irony of these seemingly overlapping occurrences, things that seem too poetic to have happened in real life. Therein precisely Hegel sees a manifestation or an example of the machinations of world spirit, of the idea in its own unfolding or becoming. Now, what I'd like to do in the remaining time of this lecture is I would like to talk a little bit about one of Hegel's ideas that he came up with before he worked on the phenomenology, when he was lecturing at Jena. One of the ideas that Hegel would have included in his lectures when Goethe said that he needed to take a rhetoric class. And this is an idea that he developed in his so-called Jena Realphilosophie. For those of you who are into Slavoj Žižek's philosophy, this is actually one of Žižek's favorite ideas. He returns to it over and over and over again, in particular because Hegel lays out what appears to be a theory of the unconscious. It's Hegel at his most Freudian, if you were. And this is a passage in which he writes about the so-called night of the world, which is how Žižek refers to it. But in the passage in German, it's actually the night of the self. It's the night of the subject. And it's a very poetic passage, and I actually would like to read it out to you. I have it here on my computer. Unfortunately, as I'm traveling, I do not carry a copy of the collected Hegel's works with me, which I probably should, but I don't. So I have it here. You can also find it online. And Hegel essentially describes a he comes up with a description, an example of spirit. So you could say essentially he is answering the hypothetical question, what is spirit? What is idea? And what Hegel is doing here is that he's introducing the notion that spirit equals negation. And before I read the passage out to you, I want to briefly explain what negation looks like for Hegel. For Hegel, the most human thing in the world is not to have to listen to your drives, to give in to your drives. For example, for Hegel, let's say that you have to go to the bathroom or that you want a drink of water. This isn't the essence of what it means to be human for Hegel. This is simply the animal nature in human. Instead, for Hegel, the cataclysm, to use a dramatic word, but really the founding instance, the foundation of all human subjectivity, is precisely being able to resist your drive or your urge. So let's say that you are thirsty, but you're playing a video game or you're working on a research paper. You can stay working and defer getting a drink of water. Of course, you can't do it forever, but you can do it for a certain amount of time. You can, be teaching a class, but also have to go to the bathroom. And yet, to be a human being is to say, I'll go to the bathroom when the class is over. For Hegel, this is the core of being alive, of being a human, is being able to exert the will to resist your natural inclinations, your natural needs. Here, Hegel is actually being very Aristotelian. Aristotle's definition of man as a political animal essentially argues that man, I say here man in the universal sense, mankind, not men, mankind finds its natural, quote unquote, function in the world by means of leaving nature behind, by means of quote unquote unnatural activities, staying up late at night, having debates about politics, etc. None of this is a natural inclination, and yet this is precisely how mankind finds its true nature, namely in the polis, in political communion with others. And so for Hegel, this idea that the most human gesture is precisely to act against one's own nature is the inner negation or the self-relating negativity of man, which is another way of saying that you are most alive when you are exerting your will above your nature. And therefore, for Hegel, in his system, because this is again part of a larger theory, in his system of Sittlichkeit, in his system of manners, he writes that discipline and self-discipline is therefore the most human activity, the most human gesture. That a human can say, I am not going to sleep tonight because I need to write a research paper that has to be done tomorrow. A human will take large quantities of caffeine or other stimulants in order to stay up through the night to do something important. That therefore, subjectivity is about negating the natural. That's Hegel's idea, and it's a key part of his idea of the subject. And the passage I'm about to read you, Hegel essentially then draws he extrapolates from this an even more radical idea, the other side of the coin, if you will, which is that if the key to subjectivity is the self-relating negativity, the ability to exert your will, to discipline yourself and act against your own nature, then what if this unnatural activity is precisely the true nature of the absolute? In other words, what if the human being who rages against his own natural inclinations, his own weaknesses, his own urges and drives, what if this is precisely how idea unfolds, how the absolute finds its inner necessity? What if the subject is the self-relating negativity of the absolute? In fact, the way in which he writes about this is to say that fundamentally, every person alive realizes that they are mortal, that they have a finite existence, and that therefore there's a specific amount of time in which they can do something that it will matter to them. This knowledge of your own death therefore means that death is not a real thing that can be grasped. Death is a concept. It's, if you will, a figure of judgment, to go back to Kant. You know that you will die, and because you know that you will die, you have to figure out how to live. It's like the clock is already ticking. It's ticking against you. And this very knowledge of your own death creates the impetus, the necessity of doing something with your life. It's a fairly obvious idea. And yet, what Hegel is arguing is that therefore death is not a thing that can ever be grasped. As soon as you're dead, you can't think or conceptualize death. And so death simply appears as the inner limit of life, namely not life, absence of life. But if death therefore imbues life with meaning, then this means that the inner limit of life is necessary or constitutive to it. That death, not real material death, but the concept of death, therefore, is what sustains the notion of life. And then Hegel, again, a system builder, relates this back to the absolute, to idea. Perhaps subject is that which absolute cannot grasp. And yet, subject is what fills in retroactively the absolute with idea. What if the subject is the inner limit of the absolute? Namely, not a predetermined historical overarching grand narrative in which the subject is a mere puppet or an automata that falls in the predetermined coordinates of idea. What if idea is precisely only that which retroactively is filled in through the subjective inability to follow or carry out some absolute preordained goal or necessity? What if the failure of the subject to be true to the whole is therefore precisely what constitutes the whole? Here you can see how Hegel is closer to Plato than to Aristotle. Plato, after all, was the first great system builder. Plato wanted to create an idea, which he called the dialectic, in which the manner in which you acted or didn't act, or said or didn't say something, was a necessary part of the unfolding of the whole. The Platonic dialectic works like this. You have two figures who engage in dialogue. Usually we see this in the Socratic dialogue, in which Plato puts words into the mouth of his master, Socrates, and an interlocutor, either an adversary, a sophist, or an acolyte, a student, who says yes, master, or no, master. And that in the exchange of ideas, as these ideas bounce back and forth, we find in the wrong paths and the erroneous conceptions of truth, we find the ideal unfolding of the true. And for Plato, therefore, if you want to put Plato into a punchline, the punchline was there are no shortcuts. That the true isn't something you start with that has to be defended against falsehood. That truth lies precisely when you go through falsehood, falsehood revealing itself. This is where Hegel later gets the idea of the cunning of reason from. When he writes about die List der Vernunft, he's writing about this dialectic, this back and forth that Plato already suggests. Now, as I'll explore in further live streams, this dialectic for Hegel, a word which he uses very sparsely, is not the same as the Platonic dialectic, but the instinct or the inclination towards system building is certainly there, and the necessity of the subject in relationship to the absolute. Aristotle, on the other hand, simply believed that there was such an idea as an ideal virtue, a pure form, to put it in Platonic terms, and that therefore reason, or subjectivity, namely the ability to conceptualize the world through images, was therefore an instrument of reason, instrumental reason, as Aristotle calls it. That therefore beauty was simply a reflection of the ideal, or having something in its best use function was a reflection of the ideal. It's a hierarchy, it's a ladder where you have the ideal on top and you have the world of appearances on the bottom. Now, I realize that I've been teasing this passage from Hegel about the night of the world, so let me read it out to you, and I apologize that it's taken me so long to get there. So bear with me as I read this out, and in the transcript for this lecture, I'll put the whole text, which you can download on Patreon. Spirit, Geist, starts from this being, and then posits it within itself as something that is a not being, as something in general sublated, in German aufgehobenes. I'll explain in a moment. In so doing, spirit is the representational power of imagination, which he calls Einbildungskraft, as such. It is the self against itself. At first, spirit is intuition. It places itself in opposition to the self. The object is not its object now, but rather its own intuition. The content of the perception as its own content. You know, I have to admit something. Jelly's gonna laugh. I actually started reading out the paragraph that comes before the Night of the Worlds. So I actually have to, I realize this one is like, we would need to do this one bit by bit. So I apologize. This is Hegel being very obscure. The paragraph, I should have highlighted this. The paragraph that I wanted to read to you is actually a lot easier. I was reading this and I was like, no, it's like, this is way too. Okay, I'm going to read you the paragraph of the Night of the World, which is actually the one I want. It's the next paragraph. Again, I'll put this in the transcript so you can find it. Apologies. So what we're reading now is the paragraph in the Jena Realphilosophie about the Night of the World, which is the next paragraph. Here he says, so the question is, what is spirit? And he says, spirit is in possession of the image here being conceptual reason. It's everything that appears to you, phenomenology. It is stored in the spirit's treasury in the night. Here we have the beginning of Hegel's idea of the night. The image is unconscious, i.e., it is not displayed as an object for representation. If you read this, you can understand why Slavoj Žižek, in his psychoanalytic reading of Hegel, would already be interested in the link between Hegel and the Freudian death drive, because Hegel mentions here the unconscious, which is, of course, Freud's central contribution to, if you will, his anti-philosophy, psychoanalysis. The image is unconscious. By image, you should know here that Hegel means subjectivity. He means everything that appears in the world. So the opposite to the absolute. The human being, writes Hegel, the human being is this night. This empty nothing which contains everything in its simplicity, a wealth of infinitely many representations, images, none of which occur to it directly, and none of which are not present. This is the night, the interior of human nature, existing here, pure self. And in phantasmagoric representations, it is night everywhere. Here a bloody head shoots up, and there another white shape, only to disappear as suddenly. We see this night when we look a human being in the eye, looking into a night which turns terrifying. For from his eyes, the night of the world hangs out towards us. It's almost a little bit like Nietzsche's well-known idea that if you gaze into the abyss gazes back at you. Hegel's making a couple of arguments here that we can lay out quite like formulaically because, again, it's a system. Hegel essentially says that spirit, I'm writing it down here to help, spirit is image. However, spirit is all the images. And where are all these images contained? They're contained in a treasury, like a giant hoard. But where is this treasury? Well, the treasury is in the subject. And therefore, in the subject, in the night of subjectivity, the night of the self, which for Hegel is pure self, namely universal, not one person has more images and the other person has less images, or in someone's world is less bright and the other one is more bright. It's universal, pure self, as it were. In the subject, we therefore find the night. And now you can see that Hegel has a beautiful idea, which is that the subject exists in the night of the world. Namely, the absolute is hidden from us. It's not there. We simply have appearances. And yet, the night is itself reflected back in the subject. In other words, there's no point of reference or pure truth in the subject. There's no authentic position from which the subject can speak or reason or know. Instead, this night of the world, this pure reflection of images, we find phantasmagorical images. He literally writes about chopped off heads that are flying through the night. And that when you look someone in the eye, when you have this tautological overlap, when you look someone in the eye and you fall into their eyes, what you see, therefore, is nothing. Or to cite King Lear, from nothing comes nothing. And in this interrelationship between two nothings, the nothing of the absolute and the nothing of the subjective soul, although soul is not a term Hegel uses, and the intersubjective nothing of one particular subject versus the other, within this, we find self-relating negativity raised to the level of the absolute, which is to say that if the subject is that which manifests self-relating negativity from within, and therein reflects the system or the form of the self-relating negativity of the universal, then this means that the subject is both in the night of the world and is himself this very night. Hence why I started this lecture by saying that it's not just the Nacht, what is it? Not just die Nacht des, that I need to remember what the German was. It's not just die Nacht im, yes, it's not just die Nacht im Menschen, but it is die Nacht des Menschen. If you say die Nacht im Menschen, it means the night in the subject. If you say the night of the subject, it means that it's a quality of the subject. From a Kantian perspective, the difference is absolutely crucial, because for Kant, what appears to us are qualities of things. And therefore, Hegel's essentially arguing that the quality of the subject is precisely the very same thing as the content of the absolute, which is a hugely radical gesture. In fact, if you wanted to simplify, you could say that Hegel's system is his version of the Kantian critique, namely where Kant writes die Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the critique of pure reason, Hegel writes the system of pure reason, where Kant writes that subjective appearances are the barrier towards achieving pure, absolute, pure reason. Hegel sees the subject as the key that unlocks the absolute. That in the subject, into the fall into subjectivity, we find the realization of the absolute. If you want to put that in like a graph to make it even more simple, although this is a simplification, you could essentially say that in the metaphysical binary, going back to Plato's system, we have on the one hand absolute, pure form, versus reason, reason being conceptual knowledge in the world, things that you can know of the world. And the Kantian critique is to say, how can you subjectively know the absolute if the very conceptualization of the absolute already means that it is no longer absolute? It has already seeped into subjective consciousness. It's a bit like Anselm's theorem as to the proof to the existence of God. Anselm essentially argues that God exists because we can't think or know God. That if we could prove that God exists, if we could think or conceptualize God properly, God would no longer be absolute. God would simply be another manifestation of particular appearance. Therefore, God is absolute precisely because we cannot conceive of him as being particular. Hegel makes a similar argument apropos Kant. Kant argues that we cannot conceive of the absolute, of idea, because subjective reason would already pierce the balloon of the absolute. Hegel says there is no absolute a priori. There's only the absolute that resides within the night of the world, which is therefore the night of the subject, but also the night in the subject, through which the content of the form of the absolute is revealed. Now, I want to briefly circle back to the beginning of this lecture, because I know this is complicated and we have more time to work this through. But remember I began by saying that Hegel was responding to Fichte, his subjective philosophy, and Schelling's world spirit philosophy or Naturphilosophie. He takes a little bit of both, if you look precisely. Schelling's idea, Schelling's idealism, was that we had an absolute, which was the absolute foundation of everything, an Urgrund, a primordial foundation upon which everything in the world exists. And that therefore all subjective appearances in the world, all concepts, all forms of particular reason, were therefore reflections of this absolute. Fichte, on the other hand, went in the other direction. Fichte said the only absolute lies within the subject. It's like a radicalization of the cogito ergo sum. And so we have a radicalized Cartesian subject in Fichte. I think, therefore I am, becomes everything is because I think. And we have Schelling's mysticism, his idea of a God who is absolute, and yet in his absolution, he also contains that which is his own negation, his own other. And his own other, therefore, being part of his absolution, becomes the particular worlds. It's almost a theosophy, if you will, at that point. Hegel takes these two thinkers, Fichte on the one hand, the idealist of pure subjectivity, and Schelling, the idealist of pure nature or the absolute. And he combines them like two Lego pieces, essentially. And if you think about it, Kant's critique of pure reason, which is not a system, but it was a critique of the very idea of a system, Hegel reunites or restores. Hegel is therefore the distinctly Hegelian figure who both irredeemably breaks philosophy and metaphysics and ushers in an era of post-metaphysics, inasmuch as he is the great redeemer, the great reconciler, that what Kant broke in traditional metaphysics, Hegel seeks to restore, which makes Hegel actually the, I don't know what the word is for this, the person who continues, who holds the torch, or who repeats what Plato did. Plato saw within sophism that which destroyed the possibility of a system, of a complete philosophy. And Plato created a system that would include everything. And so he was trying to bring metaphysics back together. Hegel does the same thing. Hegel tries to reunite the Fichtean and Schellingian split, which was initiated by Kant's critique, back into a system. And so if a critique is that which attacks the idea of a system, Hegel creates a system. He restores it. And yet, and this is perhaps the crucial thing to know about Hegel if you already know Hegel, if you want to get into Hegel. Hegel also breaks metaphysics, irredeemably so. Many people who don't like Hegel say they don't like him because everything went wrong. Philosophy and metaphysics was broken. But what does Hegel break? Well, essentially, it works like this. Hegel creates a system, which is its own anti-system. Hegel creates a metaphysics, which is no longer metaphysically latched onto the idea of a pure form. Kant's question, can reason be pure? Hegel laughs at. He says, your assumption is that there is such a thing as a priori pure absolute. Reason is therefore not the antithesis of the absolute. It's no longer the starting point from which the absolute might be obtained, which had hitherto been the very project of philosophy and metaphysics überhaupt. Now, reason finds itself in the subjects. And so we have a system which is an anti-system. We have a dialectic of that which seems to escape the dialectic. We have an absolute that resides only in the night of the world, which is both the night of the subject and the night in the subjects. And therefore what Hegel's interested in is no longer the metaphysical content, but the content that lies within the metaphysical form. And so Hegel's quote-unquote return to metaphysics is not a reactionary gesture by which he tries to undo the Kantian Copernican turn. Instead, Hegel completes it. Hegel redeems metaphysics by irrevocably breaking it. That is Hegel's project, which is why after Hegel, philosophy takes on the form of post-metaphysics, of anti-philosophy, the very project of metaphysics by which the subject is lost and has to be reunited in a kind of divine pure form of bliss, no longer stands or holds. And so ironically, Hegel is the philosopher who shows up at Jena too late. The highlight of Jena intellectual life has already passed. Fichte and Schelling have already moved on. Goethe hopes that Hegel might be the person who brings back metaphysical inquiry to Jena, and hopes that he can exchange inspiring ideas with philosophers, scientists, and poets, as his predecessors did. But Hegel wants none of that. Hegel wants to create a system of philosophy, a system that absorbs all other sciences, all other conceptual forms of thought, which he called Verstand, namely subjective, particular knowledge of the world. And his system, which would therefore become the system of Vernunft, or reason with a capital R, is the system that exposes what he calls spirit or idea, which is the content that lies in the form through which the traditional metaphysical object of absolute spirits was no longer possible. It is a system that completely goes against the previously existing metaphysical systems. It's a revolution within human thought. And so Hegel's poor rhetoric, his not being a good lecturer who could inspire his students with nuggets of wisdom and trivia, he was doing exactly what he set out to do. He arrived in Jena to save philosophy from itself. As Hegel described it, when philosophy paints its gray in gray, this is how you know that philosophy is dying, that it has to be saved from itself. And for Hegel, the very romantic ideal of interdisciplinary knowledge, in which everybody contributed something, this was anathema to what Hegel believed in. Hegel believed in a system to end all systems, and that's what he tried to do in the Phenomenology of Spirit. But it's fun to go back to the Jena Realphilosophie, where Hegel's still working out these ideas, the idea of negation, the idea of the night of the world, which is a very poetic passage. It uses tropes from romantic writing, the idea of gazing into somebody else's eyes and falling into the abyss of pure self-reflecting negativity, etc. Hegel is still becoming Hegel. He is not yet the man who would be. And the ultimate romantic, idealist irony is, of course, therefore, as I said before, that it is exactly at the moment that Napoleon comes to take the city of Vienna that Hegel's manuscript of the Phenomenology of Spirit is being sent out of Vienna. Napoleon, world spirit riding on his horse, as Hegel describes him, therefore moves into Vienna as Hegel's manuscript, namely world spirit in textual form, is moving into the world. And herein we have perhaps the ultimate idealist romantic irony, the beginning and the end of metaphysics, the beginning and the end of Hegel's career, the beginning which is both end and beginning. That is what I would suggest you take into account when you start reading Hegel. I'm going to be making more of these videos, so if you'd like to learn more about Hegel, please do consider downloading my Guide to Hegel ebook, which you can find on Patreon. You can also find all my lectures and transcripts for these lectures on Patreon. Most of all, I want to say thank you so much to everybody who joined us on Instagram and YouTube. It brings me so much joy that we've created this space for philosophical and theoretical discussion. And my goal is to bring you these ideas in a way that is hopefully accessible, perhaps even entertaining, without dumbing them down. Because personally, I think that these ideas are more interesting when we keep their complexity alive. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week. And if you're a patron, you can join me for the post-lecture discussion live on Discord. I'll see you there.